So I'm back on the riverbank, on the daily walk, and I often come up the valley and wonder what it was like when the whole valley was thick with oak forest. Whitby was one of the great shipbuilding ports of this country. They say that Captain Cook's first ship, the ship with which he discovered Australia, took 250 oak trees to build. And that was just one ship. And I always think about how the British Navy sailed away on the oak trees of England, but at what cost? And in relation to hobs and bogles and hobgoblins, hobhoulards, hobbylanthorns, we have will-o'-the-wisps, jack-o'-lanterns, gitcansticks, ginny burnt-tails, and these come from the realm of the fairy. And this landscape was believed by the people of the Emerald Islands to be enchanted right the way through to the Middle Ages. And it would be hard to doubt that, really, because up until then, this country was an enchanted Eden, a garden, a green treasure. But mention of fairy folk goes way, way, way back into the very first written accounts of histories in this country. And you don't have to dig far to find many written accounts of sightings of the little people. They are our otherworldly friends. They inhabit realms of the imaginal, the metaphysical, the esoteric, and very often a liminal place between here and the realms beyond. Even today, in countries like Iceland, their belief in the elves is so profound that they will move the route of a highway in order to accommodate the elvish folk that live under a mountain or in a certain cave. North Yorkshire is covered in fairy plains, fairy places, groves, little delves by the river. Wherever you see a circle of white flowers or yellow flowers or a circle of fungi, you can be sure the little people are somewhere nearby. And there is a famous story up here that in the valley of Great Fryupdale, it's an Old Norse word, Fryupdale. It comes from the Nordic, from when the Vikings invaded this landscape. But in Great Fryupdale, you will see an amazing, beautiful, big, curvaceous mound separating one side of the valley from the other. And there you will find Fairy Cross Plain. Now, Yorkshire folk, especially farming folk, are very, very down-to-earth people. They're not bound to fantasy. But there is a famous story recorded by a local vicar, 40 years in a moorland parish. He wrote a book, Canon Atkinson, and in this book, numerous references to folklore and tales he was told by local folk in this parish, and one of which was the story of a farmer's wife who lived at Fairy Cross Plain. And when he was speaking with her, she said, "Oh yes," she said, "I see the fairy folk all the time." She was so matter-of-fact about it. She said, "They come past my back door often, and I see them go down into a hole in the ground under the bridge by that stone over there." Of course, she was speaking in a much older Yorkshire dialect, by yon steen over there. And right at that moment, her husband came by, and she said, "Well, if the moles can live under the ground, then why can't the fairy folk?" But what she really said was, if the mouldy warps can't live down there, then why can't fairies? There is another place near the Boggle Cave at Runswick Bay, and it's called Claymore Well. And there is also well known documented accounts of the Bogles of Claymore Well, and they were the fairy folk who used to go there to do their washing, and they say they could hear them beating the laundry with their battledores. Those were the big sticks, the flat sticks of wood with which they would beat the laundry. But these sprites, these magical entities, these creatures of the woodland realm, they appear in folklore and legend all over the world. They were elemental beings, they are elemental beings. They are the devas, the nymph, the nature spirit. They are spirits of trees, of rivers. They're related to the elements. They are related to gods and goddesses. They are suffused often with a certain glow. They're either seen as creatures or they're suffused with a certain ethereal glow, like little light beings. William Blake, the poet, famously described one night when he'd been sitting in his garden and he'd seen a procession of little people in the colours of green and grey, like little grasshoppers, carrying a dead body on a rose leaf. And they buried the body in the ground with song and then disappeared. They can appear and disappear at will. Witches were most famous, really, for being able to communicate with these spirits. And it was these nature spirits, or call them fae, the fairy, that instructed our ancestors, those who were steeped in the culture of the pagan, the relationship with nature, land and spirit, the wise women who inhabited the hedgerows. And it was through conversation with these spirits that the spirits educated certain women on the magical properties of plants. Now, of course, now the scientists are discovering that plants are fully conscious and have a given intelligence. And we know that each plant has a particular quality and a magic with properties that will heal us from all manner of both physical and emotional and mental disorders, or diseases. But other indigenous cultures definitely believe that illness and disorder is are often themselves a form of an elemental or an entity. It's also interesting to consider that the bubonic plague, the Black Death, was greatly exacerbated by the killing of cats. And back then in the Middle Ages, so many cats were killed here and in Europe in the demonizing of these most magical feline creatures because they were considered associates of witches. And when they began through the many centuries to banish magic, witchcraft, enchantment, and to demonize the fairy folk, to call them the work of the devil, there came a terrible loss of our relationship with the earth as a very magical, enchanted realm. Of course, the fairy folk are still here, and you can find them. In the twilight, it is said, is when they will appear, down on the riverbank, in a copse, in a glade. And I often think of this place, the Esk Valley, as a place that was once thick with oak trees, wild ancient English woodland, and there would have been glades in the forest, and those fairy rings, and on midsummer nights and May days and Halloweens, the little folk would come and dance under the starlight. In the realm of the woodland nymph, there were many pathways and small little byways that they say were fairy paths. Sometimes people would even knock the corner off their house to allow the fairy folk to pass by, because you must never block a fairy path. It is also said that in Whitby, in the dead of winter, the fairies would arrive with their little suitcases and they would walk up the stairs into the houses to burrow in for the winter. Of course, this might be where the origin of house spirits comes from, or the borrowers, the little people who will borrow and take shiny things, things of good use, perhaps your favourite scarf, perhaps your favourite pencil, who's to say? But they abound in the culture of this country. Of course, Ireland is full of reference to the She, the Tuatha De Danann, Finn McCool, the supernatural, otherworldly beings. Our Arthurian legends are littered with reference to the magical, to the fairy, to the magician. The Welsh Mabinogion, the great myths and legends of this country. Everything is woven through with the supernatural, with the magical, with the enchanted. And at the core of these tales is always some reference to the fairy folk. And they are, of course, so deeply buried in the nature of this land. The fairy, they really are the spirit of Great Britain.